Hello guys, today we will be talking about a very commonly misunderstood graph in your price mechanism chapter. This is the price adjustment process. So you may have heard your teacher or the school notes keep saying the price adjustment process, but what exactly is it? So today we will understand what's the purpose of this graph, and then how do we apply it in your price mechanism demand supply curve. Okay, so as the name suggests, the price adjustment process talks about how price changes. So when you recall for your price mechanism chapter, what are the instances where your price change? So your price change when in your demand supply curve you have a change in, say, your demand curve, your supply, or both. Because when we look at the change in the price through your demand supply changes, we will denote it in your demand supply curve. So always label your graph properly: price, quantity. And then we always start off by drawing our initial equilibrium. So also label your demand supply curve properly, because later on when you have the shift it will be more messy. So good to denote all the initial points as naught. So D naught, S naught, P naught, Q naught. This is the steady state of an economy if nothing happens. But always when we do analysis of demand supply curve, we will have to link what happens in the, say, CSQ or preamble that talks about changes to the economy, and then we have to link them to demand supply factors, which eventually moves your demand curve or your supply curve. So in this case, let's look at a simple example first. So to illustrate the price adjustment process, so let's assume that your demand curve shift right. Perhaps there is a shift in taste and preferences towards a particular good. So it increases your demand, as now people are more willing to buy this good. So what happens is the impact to your price and quantity is that your quantity increase and your price increase. So this one is straightforward, because you just have to look at the new intersection of the new demand curve and the supply curve, which is unchanged in this case, and then you can tell that, oh, the impact to price is that price has increased. However, this is not a complete answer, because you are just describing what happened on the graph, which is that the price is higher, but you need to talk about the reason why the price increased. So this is where the price adjustment process comes about, because in a way you need to explain why the price increase when there is a rightward shift of your demand curve. So how do we even start this process? Because here we are saying that the outcome that we want to arrive at is that price increase. But how do we show that this happens? From the graph you can just describe all, because that is where the new intersection is. But if you think about it, actually you're not answering the question, because you haven't addressed the why. Why does price increase when demand increase? So to answer this question, we need to understand, why must the price change? What happens if the price don't change? So if we look at before the price change, it will be looking at your P0. So what happens is, if your price don't change but your demand change, so what you do is that you identify the P0 and touch the new demand curve at D1, and this is your quantity demanded when the demand increase. For your quantity supply, it will be at your QS because your supply curve is unchanged. So when you touch the P0, it will be at QS. So here at this point, you see that at this P0, there is a problem. So here you have a shortage. A shortage of the quantity that the society needs because your quantity demanded is more than your quantity supply. So there is a problem if you don't change your price. Hence, to solve this problem and by free market forces without the government's intervention, you have to make your price increase. So you talk about the issue first, why you need to increase the price. So you say that at P0, your quantity demanded is more than quantity supply and therefore there is a shortage. So you need to provide a solution for that, right? Because the shortage will not go away and assuming there is no government intervention. So the free market has to do something to close this shortage. So you say that at this point where there is a shortage, this is critical. So you mentioned there is this upward pressure on price. Because when you say there is an upward pressure, it means that the price will be forced to increase to address the shortage. So when you talk about there is an upward pressure on price, then you say that P increases to P1. So you have to show that, when the price is at P1, what happens? So you say that at P1, your quantity demanded is equals to your quantity supplied, which is at Q1. So you have reached an new equilibrium state where you are at P1, Q1, and there is no shortage. Because when you increase price, you are actually doing two things. So first, you reduce the quantity demanded and you increase the quantity supply. So you see for the two blue color quantity demanded and supply on the graph, they converge. As you move from P0 to P1, they converge. It's a movement along these two lines, your supply and demand, and they converge to be equal at P1. So at this point, you have addressed the shortage through the price adjustment process. The price has adjusted to be higher to close the shortage gap. Okay, so this is the simpler example because we only have one shift in the graph. How about when we have more than one shift, meaning that we have both the demand and supply curve shifting? So here actually the principle is the same, but you just have to look at one additional curve, which is now the new supply curve as well, because for this example, we talk about only the demand shifting. So we also have to look at when the supply shift, what happens. So again, we draw out our demand supply graph. So this should be quite fast, this drawing. It shouldn't take you more than 10 seconds. So you draw your initial equilibrium, Q0, P0, supply, S0, demand D0. Okay, so now we assume that there are two shifts happening, which is actually very common for your exam. It is no longer the one shift. The one shift that you see is when your teacher is trying to give you practice or ramp you up for the content, but now you should expect that minimally it will be both the demand and supply curve shifting. So here we assume that, okay, supply shift right. This could be because there is a higher adoption of technology that makes your producer more willing and able to supply more goods because now it is more productive, using less resources, things like that. Then on the other hand, you have a rightward shift in your demand curve as well. So assuming that perhaps there is an increase in income of household, which then increases people's purchasing power and then increases their demand for goods and services. So here now, we will also identify the new equilibrium. In this case, it is at P1 and Q1, where the two new demand and supply curve intersect. So again, now you know the outcome. The outcome is that the price increase, but how do you explain what happens in the interim? How does the price adjust? So again, we look at the initial price, which is P0, and we show what happens if price don't adjust. Meaning that if price remains at P0, what will happen? So you need to show that there is a problem. So here when we look at P0, now we need to move it to touch the new supply curve and the new demand curve. In this case, my quantity supply is at QS. My quantity demanded is at QD. You need to be able to identify this correctly. So again, there is a problem of shortage because my QD is more than QS. So what happens here? When there is a shortage, there is an upward pressure on price. So you say at P0, your QD is more than QS and there's a shortage. After that, you talk about how there is an upward pressure on price. So I look at the new price as the direction which I want to talk about. Because if it's a decrease in price, then I will say, oh, there is a downward pressure on price. So this is just putting the word there to show the process. So upward pressure on price. So this results in my P increasing to P1. So you say that at P1, actually my quantity demanded fall, my quantity supply increase. This is the law of demand and supply, where your price increase, your quantity demanded decrease. When your price increase, your quantity supply increase. So this movement of the price and the reduction and the increase of quantity demanded and supply respectively actually helps me to adjust to the new price. So here, because at this point I have a shortage and at this point as well, so you see that these two direction, they converge to meet at P1, where now your quantity demanded equals to quantity supply equals to your new equilibrium. So here there is no more shortage already. So you see how the market adjusts itself to achieve new equilibrium when something happens in the economy, because at the original equilibrium it is assumed that nothing happened, but during our analysis we have seen how things happen that affect your demand and your supply, and then how it impacts your price and your quantity. So when the question talks about the impact to the market, talk about how it impacts both the price and your quantity arising from the demand supply shift. But you always have to talk about this price adjustment process, then you can account for why the price change. In terms of quantity, then you don't really need to talk about that, but do take note to have this, because if you didn't, the teacher will maybe mark one or two, mark your marks, want to do marks down lah. Yep, so do note that this is a very important, yet students tend to miss or don't understand process. So yes, hope this helps. Okay, bye.